Ready yourselves. They want to tell you our secret.
Moving deeper into the mystery, with those final botanical anomalies finally mapped out, we hit the ultimate challenge. How do we pull all these scattered, totally random-looking clues together into a single, unbreakable code? We've already deconstructed the physical makeup of this pirate sanctuary, right? We looked at the ancient river incisions that masked those tall ship masts, and those deep clay canyons that gave them the absolute perfect interior blind spots. But as you know, just finding the pieces, that's really only half the battle.
So how exactly do we decode the ultimate blueprint of this massive maritime labyrinth? Look, a modern investigator literally cannot rely on just one single clue. It's just not going to work. We have to synthesize totally independent streams of data into one cohesive framework. We've got to take the shifting sandbars, the dense peat matrix, and those subtle soil disturbances and unify them all into one master sequence. It's like putting together a giant puzzle where the pieces keep moving.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Grand Synthesis, a 6-step field exploration algorithm.
Let's dive right into this definitive algorithm required to decode basically any coastal or riverine site in the Chesapeake Basin. To do this at a professional grade, you need absolute precision. First, we start macro with deep-time bathymetric analysis, comparing ancient maps against modern lidar. Then, we get micro with hydrographic path finding, literally calculating tidal draft limits to pinpoint those hidden channels. Step 3 is geomorphological shoreline scanning, where we're hunting for unnatural 90-degree bends and sheer clay walls. After that, acoustic ground truthing verifies what's actually lurking in the shadows. Finally, step 5 and 6, you gotta get your hands dirty. We're testing the soil stratigraphy for human interference and using botanical fingerprinting to absolutely lock in the site's history. It is a beautifully structured process.
But, of course, there are serious risks out there. Section 2, Estuarian Hazards and Surviving the Physical Threats.
Actually applying this algorithm out in the remote pockets of the Chesapeake, it is incredibly perilous. It demands your absolute respect. Beyond those deceptive peat shelves we talked about, modern explorers face the terrifying reality of silt traps. We're talking about fine, unconsolidated mudflats that act exactly like quicksand. If you step out there during low tide without the proper load-bearing footwear, man, you can be trapped instantly. No joke.
And honestly, if the mud doesn't get you, the water absolutely will. Out in the remote marsh grids of the Tangier Sound, sudden violent tidal surges can completely submerge low-lying islands and your escape routes under several feet of water in literally less than an hour. So your environmental awareness out there, it's a matter of life and death. You could be entirely cut off from the mainland in a matter of minutes.
Because of all this, navigating these dense, totally unmanaged white cedar swamps requires some really strict biological safeguards. We are talking full-body protective gear, satellite comms, and strict, unwavering adherence to local tide tables. Those are simply non-negotiable. Plus, you're walking into an environment with super heavy concentrations of lime-carrying deer ticks. Oh, and let's not forget the venomous copperhead snakes that love to hide right in the brush. You have to be hyper-aware.
Then there's the legal side of things. Section 3, Maritime Preservation Laws, the unyielding wall of legislation.
Moving past the physical hazards, you hit this massive, unyielding wall of federal and state mandates. These laws fiercely protect these irreplaceable chapters of early American history. The days of lawless treasure hunting, yeah, those are completely over. The Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1987 hands ownership of submerged wrecks straight to the state. Then you've got NHPA Section 106 protecting sites on public lands, plus state-specific antiquities codes in Maryland and Virginia that absolutely ban metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and even shovels.
Which brings us to what we call the ethical investigator's creed. It's the stark difference between plundering and documentation. If you stumble upon 18th century ship timbers or colonial pottery, you do not start digging. Plunder destroys the structural context, completely ruining the site. True discovery is entirely measured by precise GPS logging, taking detailed stratigraphic photography and reporting everything to state authorities. Preserving that context is literally the only way archaeologists can actually piece together these lost global trade networks.
Bringing this all together, this matrix serves as your ultimate operational manual. It perfectly aligns your exploration phases with the estuarian hazards, the right verification tools, and those strict legal compliances we just discussed. Whether you are dodging sandbars and tidal surges during hydrographic recon using depth finders, or scanning the land with portable lidar to avoid those nasty silt sinks and snakes, Every single step requires you to balance your scientific discovery with total environmental and legal safety. You cannot have one without the other.
Which leads us to our final takeaway. Section 4, Conclusion, the immortal Chesapeake spirit.
When you take a step back and view this ghost grid in its entirety, it really changes everything. It completely redefines these historical figures. The outlaws who turned the Chesapeake Bay into their personal fortress weren't just a bunch of aimless outcasts. No, they were accidental geologists. They were master hydrographers. They looked at a fractured, messy coastal plain and saw an absolute masterpiece of tactical security. They weaponized the Earth's deep-time processes to their advantage.
By decoding this intricate maritime labyrinth, we're doing a lot more than just tracing the pathways of some long-lost privateer sloops. We are actually uncovering the incredibly intimate and complex relationship between human history and the dynamic, ever-changing skin of planet Earth. And the wildest part, the ghost grid of the Chesapeake remains exactly where it has always been, quietly operating right beneath the surface of our modern world.
And that leaves us with one final thrilling thought to chew on. All those environmental signatures, the acoustic shadows, the botanical anomalies, they are still out there. The clues are patiently waiting for the trained eye. So the next time you're standing out there, looking closely at the shoreline, are you prepared to read the true, hidden history of the American wilderness? Will you be the one to finally decode it?
Stepping out of those subaquatic river canyons and right onto solid Earth, our investigation immediately slams into something staggering. We're talking about a massive, heavily camouflaged terrestrial shadow network.
It turns out these pirate syndicates literally weaponized the geology of the mid-Atlantic. They transformed the coastline into a totally unmapped underground banking system. I mean, think about it. They couldn't exactly stroll into a colonial bank in Williamsburg with chests of Spanish bullion or illegal currency, right? So they relied on the shoreline. And to pull this off, they had to commit an absolutely irreversible crime against the local geology. To really grasp how they did it, we're going to decode this terrestrial matrix layer by layer.
Layer 1, subterranean shell marl vaults. We're starting at the absolute deepest level here, looking at the ancient karst cave networks carved right into the lower cliffs of the James and York rivers.
Millions of years before a single pirate ever dropped anchor in the Americas, acidic groundwater was steadily seeping through these fossilized shell beds. Step by step, it dissolved the calcium carbonate, eventually hollowing out these natural, highly secure caverns. Picture them tucked away behind collapsing clay blocks and thick native vines, sitting just inches above the brackish water table. For an outlaw on the run, this was a ready-made, highly tactical vault.
And the sheer structural advantage of these spaces is just off the charts. Compare them to your classic wooden treasure chest, the ones that easily rot, crack, or just get dug up. These natural limestone vaults offered immense rock-solid stability. They were literally strong enough to withstand pounding heavy rains, or, even better, the weight of armed colonial horsemen patrolling the cliff tops directly above, with zero risk of caving in.
But here is the absolute genius of exploiting these exact spots. The porous shell floors inside these caves functioned like a massive natural drainage filter. Any surface water that leaked in would drain out rapidly, keeping the interior humidity surprisingly stable. This quick drain action actively stopped wooden crates from dry rotting and kept iron bands from rusting out. It meant that highly moisture-sensitive plunder, we're talking heavy gunpowder barrels, fine European silks, perfectly cured colonial tobacco, could sit in these damp environments for years and remain absolutely pristine. Layer 2. Signatures of disturbed earth. Moving up from that deep limestone strata, we hit the permanent forensic evidence left behind in the dirt itself. This is what happened whenever a pirate crew grabbed their shovels and dug a long-term concealment trench.
Now, to spot the anomaly, we really need to understand the baseline. In its natural, undisturbed state, the mid-Atlantic coastal plain soil is strictly ordered. It's got these very distinct horizons. Right on top, you have the O horizon, that dark, organic-rich humus. Right under that is the A horizon, which is this light, leached, sandy loam. And finally, down at the bottom, the B horizon, a really dense, orange-red ferric clay. It is perfectly stacked, literally just like a layer cake.
But the second a crew dug a pit to stash their loot and then filled it back in, they destroyed that natural order forever. They created what we call disturbed earth, or anthropogenic soil. Basically, it's a geological anomaly where those beautifully stacked horizons are permanently churned up and mixed together by hand excavation. This is that irreversible crime I mentioned earlier. You just cannot unmix the soil. And the physical legacy of doing this is pretty astounding. Even 3 full centuries later, this disturbed earth remains fundamentally altered. because it was violently chopped up by shovels and then tossed back in loosely. It has a significantly lower density and much higher porosity than the hard-packed, untouched ground right next to it.
For a modern investigator out in the field, this creates a literal visual roadmap. You're looking for bright orange clay that's suddenly, inexplicably, speckled with dark humus, tiny bits of old charcoal, or even fragments of broken colonial brick. If you spot a clean, vertical column of mixed colors cutting through a pristine clay cliff, well, you've just found a definitive historical marker. Why? Because nature absolutely never mixes its soil horizons in clean, vertical columns. Only human hands do that.
Moving on to Layer 3, Botanical Clues and Flora. Rising up from that disturbed dirt straight to the surface canopy, we find that these historical scars actually altered the soil's chemistry and water retention capacity so much they created a living, biological treasure map above ground.
Let's trace this biological chain reaction step by step. First, the pirates dig their pit, permanently shattering those natural soil horizons. Since that refilled earth is now super aerated and loose, it acts like a sponge, naturally trapping and retaining way more moisture than the dense earth around it. Finally, that highly localized moisture anomaly triggers a totally different ecosystem. It actively invites very specific disturbed ground flora to take root.
It's almost like a beacon goes off for deep-rooting, nutrient-loving, silt-trap plants. They immediately rush in to colonize these isolated little pockets. All of a sudden, you'll see these really heavy concentrations of black walnut, pokeberry, and stinging nettle completely taking over small patches where they normally wouldn't even survive in the wider forest.
So, here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. If you're hiking through a dense, highly uniform Chesapeake pine forest, and you suddenly stumble onto an unnatural, isolated patch of black walnut, or a thick, nasty cluster of stinging nettle, you might not just be looking at weeds. You are very likely looking directly at the footprint of a historical disturbance. Literally, an anomalous patch of pokeberry could mean you are standing right on top of a 300-year-old refilled pirate vault. No joke.
And the crazy thing is, the pirates didn't even stop at the forest floor. They weaponized the entire environment, stretching all the way up to the upper canopy. They would deliberately clear out these massive old-growth trees, like Atlantic white cedars, just to create line-of-sight shadow markers that were only visible if you were out on the water. Today, those ancient cuts have been filled in by fast-growing successional vegetation, which leaves behind a structurally weird, totally anomalous forest canopy that is still there to this very day.
Mapping the coastal caches. By treating this entire shoreline as a 300-year-old crime scene, we can start to synthesize all these distinct clues and actually trace the precise physical footprint of this pirate shadow network.
Pulling this all together gives us a frankly brilliant terrestrial forensics toolkit. Think about it. We've got porous shell marl caves that we can verify by mapping the limestone drainage. We have disturbed earth easily confirmed through density testing and vertical soil color anomalies. And we have botanical markers, proven by mapping out those highly localized groups of successional flora. It all locks together into one cohesive, incredibly elegant investigative framework.
But as we navigate our way through the end of this magnificent historical labyrinth, a monumental question is staring us right in the face. We've successfully decoded subaquatic river canyons, sandbar mechanics, and now complex soil sciences. But how can a modern researcher actually combine all of these wildly different elements into a single, flawless field algorithm without making one massive critical error? Is it even possible to build a master key that decodes the entire Chesapeake Bay? We'll be tackling that exact puzzle next.
Moving deeper into the mystery of the Chesapeake's outlaw fleet, that isolating, soft peat architecture we just left behind in Tangier Sound, it suddenly vanishes, gone. Instead, we are plunged directly into this brutal, high-energy marine arena. We're talking about the exact spot where the estuary meets its maker, the absolute fury of the Atlantic Ocean.
We're dealing with a massive 30-mile-wide choke point right here, stretching between Cape Charles to the north and Cape Henry to the south. And make no mistake, this was the absolute economic throat of the mid-Atlantic colonies. Literally every single tobacco ship, slave vessel, and wealth-laden merchantman bound for London or the West Indies had to funnel right through this narrow gateway. Because of that, it was heavily patrolled, heavily fortified, and theoretically, completely impossible for unauthorized ships to navigate without detection.
But, this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the outlaws absolutely thrived here. It's like a giant geological battleground. On one side, you've got these massive freshwater rivers, the James, York, Rappahannock, and Elizabeth, just constantly pushing outward. On the flip side, you have the cyclical, brutal force of the Atlantic tides and longshore currents pushing inward. The collision between these two forces creates a highly volatile, constantly shifting environment. But here's the crucial takeaway. During the golden age of piracy, these outlaws didn't view this heavily patrolled naval gateway as a trap. No way. They saw it as a massive fluid geometric weapon. They literally weaponized the bay's hydrography to execute daring escapes and stage entirely invisible ambushes.
Let's dive right into our first tactic: ambush at Lynnhaven Roads.
This brings us to a broad, semi-sheltered bight tucked just inside Cape Henry. Now, historically, this was actually the primary deepwater staging area for the British Royal Navy and merchant fleets waiting for their convoy escorts. Yet, incredibly, it was also the absolute favorite deepwater hunting ground for legendary outlaws like Edward Thatch. You probably know him better as Blackbeard. So how on earth do you hunt your prey in the exact same room where the Navy sleeps? Well, it all comes down to a fascinating mechanism called tidal scouring. Basically, as the tide rushes out of the bay, it forces an unbelievable volume of water through a really tight bottleneck. That high-velocity ebb tide acts exactly like a giant underwater plow, carving these deep submarine trenches directly into the seafloor that run perfectly parallel to the modern shoreline.
And the pirates did turn those geological trenches into a brilliant stealth ambush matrix. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Heavily armed pirate vessels, like Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, which by the way drew over 10 feet of water, could actually anchor inside these deep trenches, incredibly close to the shore. And because Cape Henry is lined with these high shifting sand dunes, the ships were completely visually masked from the Atlantic Ocean. Step 2, they'd station lookouts right on top of those dune peaks. Then step 3, the moment a solitary merchant vessel approached the capes, the pirate sloop simply slipped out of its deepwater trench, caught a ride on that same high-velocity ebb tide, and captured their target. They did this so fast that the naval ships anchored further up the bay couldn't even manage to raise their sails in time. It was essentially a ghost strike, executed with terrifying speed.
Moving on to our next maneuver, the hydrographic blind jump.
Let's see how this whole dynamic escalates when the Navy actually managed to corner an outlaw ship. If you look directly north of the main shipping channels, stretching right across the middle of the bay's mouth, there is this vast, treacherous field of submerged sandbars. It's known as the tail of the horseshoe and the middle ground shoals. We are talking about 3 to 6 feet of clearance. That's it. Barely enough water to float a hot tub. These shoals are formed by the continuous deposition of ocean sand, pushed into the bay by violent northeasterly storms, clashing against those river sediments pushing out. The result is a terrifyingly shallow, highly unpredictable grid of underwater ridges sitting just beneath the surface. And the scariest part? It changes shape after literally every major weather event.
Now, this grid of shallow sand gave a massive tactical advantage to the pirate's sloop. Why? Because its shallow draft and flat bottom were meticulously designed to skim right over breaking waves. The Royal Navy frigate, on the other hand, is immensely heavy, has a very deep draft, and its rigid hull fractures violently upon impact with hard-packed quartz. So, when cornered by a superior Royal Navy frigate inside the lower bay, pirate captains would pull off this high-stakes maneuver that required absolute precision and, frankly, total mastery of the tide charts.
Here's how this chaotic David versus Goliath victory would actually unfold. The pirate captain wades for the absolute peak of high tide, then steers straight for the breaking waves of the middle ground shoals. To the British naval officers watching this, it literally looked like the outlaws were committing suicide by intentionally running aground. But then, the sloop effortlessly, almost gracefully, slides right over the crest of the shoal. The heavy Navy warship, of course, attempts to follow, violently strikes that hard-packed quartz sandbar, and completely shatters its hull. Meanwhile, the pirates just slide safely into the deep-water Atlantic shelf on the other side, successfully breaking the blockade. I mean, they didn't just outrun the Navy, they let the Earth itself destroy their pursuers. How wild is that?
Now let's explore our third tactic, York Spit's Vanishing Act.
Shifting our focus over to the western flank, where the York River cuts into the bay, the tactics shift from explosive, high-stakes action to this kind of eerie, tense suspense. Here we have a geographical anomaly that essentially acts as a tectonic sluice. The main deep channel here is actually guided by ancient fault lines buried deep, deep beneath the coastal plain sediment. It plunges to depths exceeding 80 feet, but, and this is a big but, it is a dangerously compressed underwater highway. It's bordered on both sides by lethal, muddy shallows caused by a long finger of sediment known as the York Spit. It is a remarkably narrow, high-velocity corridor with absolutely zero margin for error.
So, imagine pirates are fleeing naval forces from the Upper Bay. They would enter this tectonic sluice at night and deploy a classic maritime stealth tactic called dousing the glim. This simply means extinguishing every single shipboard light to completely break visual contact in the pitch black. But think about it. Navigating a narrow trench surrounded by muddy traps with zero illumination, that requires either absolute madness or just unparalleled hydrographic mastery. By hugging the extreme edge of the submarine trench, exactly where it transitions into those muddy shallows, they could completely vanish from the Navy's sight.
And here is where the geographical trap forced the Navy's hand. The Royal Navy ships were terrified of running aground in the dark along the treacherous York Spit. So what did they do? They had to freeze. They threw their anchors down right in the dead center of the deep channel. And while they sat there, the outlaws simply slipped right past them into the open ocean under the cover of total darkness. They literally left the greatest naval power on Earth anchored, blind, and entirely helpless.
Which brings us to our final section, Beyond the Ocean's Edge.
Pulling back to look at this entire structural system, it becomes pretty clear that the ocean gates were far from a simple exit. They were an absolute gauntlet. Just look at how seamlessly the outlaws matched their tactics to the literal earth beneath them. Down at Lynnhaven, the coarse sand and tidal scour pools provided the perfect masking for invisible ambushes on incoming Atlantic trade. Up in the middle ground, those brutal quartz sand ridges became grounding blockades, defeated only by high tide skimming. And over at the York Spit, the compacted silt faults provided the extreme depth transitions they needed to break visual contact at night. They took a heavily fortified 30-mile naval bottleneck and turned it into their own personalized, highly engineered escape hatch.
All of which leaves us with a pretty chilling final thought. If the ocean gates, the very front door of the colonies, heavily patrolled by the British Royal Navy, were this treacherous and this easily manipulated by the outlaw fleet, well, what horrors lay hidden in the deep interior western rivers? What kind of impenetrable sanctuaries existed up in the submerged canyons and high cliff strongholds of the Potomac and Rappahannock? Moving deeper into the mystery, the volatile Atlantic gates were really just the beginning. As we push past those coastal defenses, the plot absolutely thickens. We're now looking at an inland landscape that was completely weaponized by outlaws. They literally turned the natural geography into an impenetrable, secret fortress.
Which brings us to one of the most baffling questions of colonial maritime history. How did massive pirate ships, heavily armed, packed with stolen wealth, just vanish? I mean, completely disappear in broad daylight while naval fleets were actively hunting them. To answer this impossible tactical question, we have to follow these outlaws inland, way far away from the fleets patrolling the Atlantic coast, and look directly at the earth beneath their hulls.
Part 1. The Deep Interior Sanctuaries.
So our journey upriver reveals an environmental shield that is unlike anything on the coast. In stark contrast to the flat, exposed peat marshes of the eastern shore, the western rivers, places like the Potomac, the Rappahannock, and the York rivers, well, they're ancient, deeply incised valleys. Millions of years ago, these rivers carved massive geological highways snaking hundreds of miles straight through hard, crystalline bedrock. So while the east was this vulnerable, flat marshland, the west was a labyrinth of towering canyons, offering the absolute ultimate off-the-grid hideout.
Part 2. High cliff blind spots.
Now, the very first line of defense in these deep interior bases were the Calvert formations. These are towering cliffs of compacted silt, sand, and clay rising 100 feet vertically above the waterline. And because the river's centrifugal force pushed deep water channels to the absolute base of these drops, pirates could anchor their huge deep-draft ships directly under the sheer clay walls. They were essentially parking right up against the canyon edge.
The crucial point here is that this created what tactical landscape archaeologists call a visual radar shadow zone. Think about it. A Navy vessel could sail right down the center of the broad river, look directly at the bank, and just completely miss a pirate ship hiding in this massive visual blind spot. Because the walls rose almost completely vertically right over the ship's masts, and the dark, earthy colors of the clay perfectly absorbed the visual profile of those wooden holes and the hem ringing. The pirates were essentially cloaked. I mean, they were practically invisible from a distance.
But the crazy thing is, the disguise wasn't just visual, it was an actual acoustic trap. Think of it as nature's own stealth technology. The dense, hard composition of this Miocene clay acts like a massive acoustic mirror.
So, if a pirate crew fired a signaling cannon or shouted commands, the sound waves didn't travel horizontally down the river corridor where the naval blockades could hear them. No, instead the sound hit the canyon wall and bounced upward and outward straight into the sky, literally swallowing the noise of their operations and keeping them entirely undetected.
Part 3. The subaquatic sluice gates.
Okay, so the cliffs above the water were brilliant camouflage, sure, but the tactics used below the water? Absolutely nothing short of genius. Just beneath the surface of the Rappahannock lay this really dramatic topography of subaquatic canyons. The riverbed suddenly plunges from a totally manageable 10 feet to a terrifying 60 feet in these narrow, winding underwater valleys. And as the ocean tide pushed into the narrow mouth of the river, it created a highly pressurized hydraulic wedge. This deep underwater surge rushed upstream at double the surface current speed. Imagine a hidden underwater bullet train speeding completely against the visible flow of the river.
Knowing this highly specific bathymetry, the pirates utilized a heavy device called a trawl anchor. And to be clear, this wasn't your standard ship's anchor meant to hold a boat in place. The sheer ingenuity here is staggering. This was a specialized, incredibly heavy weight deployed by the outlaws straight down into those 60-foot submarine canyons, specifically to catch that incoming subsurface tidal bore. They were actively harnessing deep water pressure to perform a mind-bending tactical maneuver against the pursuing naval longboats.
They actually called this the invisible sled ride, and the execution was brilliant. First, drop the sails to reduce wind resistance. Second, deploy that heavy trawl anchor straight down into the submarine canyon. And finally, just let the anchor catch the massive hydraulic wedge rushing upstream. So while the Navy exhausted themselves battling the surface current with these heavy oars, the pirates were literally being towed upstream by a subsurface force at supernatural speeds. It left their pursuers entirely baffled and stranded miles behind. No way they could catch them.
Part 4. The Fall Line Redoubt.
Now, if the Navy miraculously managed to track them up the rivers, let's say up the Potomac, the pirates had one final, absolute barrier waiting for them. Because the river doesn't just go on forever. It eventually hits a massive geological wall known as the Fall Line. You go from the coastal plain, which has soft sedimentary rocks and navigable deep-water channels, straight into the Piedmont Plateau. Suddenly, it's hard metamorphic rock, violent rapids, and shallow shoals. This sudden tectonic boundary stopped literally any deep-draft ocean vessel dead in its tracks.
So what did the pirates do? Well, they made it their ultimate redoubt. Outlaws intentionally built their long-term supply depots right on these small rocky islands just below the rapids. Think about the strategic perfection of this. It's an absolute natural barrier to upstream naval navigation. The mud turns to hard granite boulders, meaning heavy ships can't anchor or maneuver at all. Furthermore, these islands were surrounded by dense, trackless wilderness. This made their supply chains completely immune to amphibious naval assaults, basically creating an unassailable fortress deep in the American interior.
Part 5. Beyond the Water's Edge.
Looking back at our journey, the defensive brilliance of these outlaw syndicates becomes incredibly clear. I mean, they read the geological rulebook of the landscape and played it to absolute perfection. The Miocene clay cliffs provided visual and acoustic cloaking. The deep bedrock canyons offered supernatural upstream escapes, and the granite boulders of the fall line ensured unassailable isolation for their depots. Every single layer of the earth was weaponized for survival and secrecy.
But as they colonized the land beyond the water's edge, they began to rely on a lot more than just natural hiding places for their ships. They actually left their ships entirely to build a highly sophisticated system of land-based infrastructure. So how exactly did outlaws utilize the unique soil compositions, dense forest grids, and natural cave networks along these very riverbanks to build massive underground caches for their plundered wealth? Well, they left behind physical footprints in the mid-Atlantic Earth, subtle botanical clues, and really strange soil anomalies that we must decode next. The ships might be gone, but the landscape still holds their colonial treasures. That is, if you know exactly how to read the dirt.
Moving deeper into the sovereign swamps, we're leaving the safe, charted river networks behind and plunging into the Chesapeake's absolute most chaotic, isolating phase. We're looking at a vast, brackish wilderness here, bound by the open bay to the west and the marshy edges of the Delmarva Peninsula to the east. Right at the heart of this sound lies this highly fragmented, low-lying archipelago dominated by the Smith and Tangier Island groups. Now, during the golden age of piracy, the Tangier Sound wasn't just some remote backwater. It operated as a completely autonomous, lawless zone. It wasn't just a convenient place to hide out, it was a geography that quite literally actively repelled authority. Okay, let's dive into this because the tactical genius of the pirates operating here was that they weaponized this incredibly fragmented, low-lying archipelago. Where conventional navies rolled up and saw this terrifying, unnavigable blur between land and water, the outlaws, well, they saw their ultimate sanctuary. They figured out how to utilize the unique, honestly almost bizarre physics of the marsh itself to build completely invisible staging bases right under the nose of the mighty British Empire. To really grasp exactly how they pulled this off, we have to contrast the geologies at play. Over on the western shores of the bay, you've got solid, reliable ground. You can chart it, you can map it, and you can easily build traditional stone forts on it. But out here in the Tangier Islands, the landforms are entirely dynamic. They're built from Holocene silt deposits, these massive matrices of decayed vegetation we call peat, and constantly shifting tidal muds. It's this living, organic, totally chaotic landscape. And as we're about to see, the outlaws used this environmental hacking to completely lock out anyone trying to hunt them down. Part 1. The Sovereign Swamps, Silt Sieves, and False Channels. Let's move to and see how this builds into the very first layer of their natural fortress, which relies entirely on the peat architecture. The islands here, specifically the complex grid that makes up the Martin National Wildlife Refuge today, are held together by these dense, root-tangled mats of smooth cordgrass and accumulated peat. So this isn't just mud, it's a living structural matrix. Over centuries, tidal forces have carved these narrow, highly volatile channels right through the peat mats. The locals call them guts. And the truly fascinating hydrographic trigger here is that these guts feature nearly vertical underwater walls of ancient compacted mud. They are incredibly stable, but totally invisible from the surface. So a pirate captain with the right local knowledge could sail a fully laden sloop straight into what appeared to a pursuing Navy ship to be a solid, impenetrable wall of grass. And when a naval cutter was right on their tail, the pirates executed this brilliant, chaotic maneuver called the silt-sieve, or mudding through. Just imagine the sheer, heart-pounding chaos of a high-speed pursuit. The pirate targets a peat gut they know is slightly too shallow. They plow their heavy wooden hull violently right into that soft, gel-like bottom silt. Boom! Instantly, this kicks up a massive, thick, churning cloud of mud right into their wake. For the pursuing vessel, it's literally like hitting a concrete smokescreen. They are instantly blinded. And even worse, the mud physically alters the water density, completely destroying the Navy ship's ability to steer or even gauge depth. Just like that, the pursuers are physically locked out of the sanctuary in a matter of seconds. But here's the crazy part. The outlaws didn't just accept the natural layout of the marsh, they actually actively engineered it. Using basic hand tools and wooden scrapers, pirate crews would go in and cut shallow decoy ditches right into the peat banks at the entrance of a sound. During high tide, these hand-cut decoys looked exactly like deep, navigable pathways. So a pursuing cutter, totally blind to the structural trap lurking beneath the water, would bank hard into the decoy channel and slam straight into a solid, submerged peat shelf. The vessel would ground instantly, hopelessly trapped as the tide rapidly receded. But physical barricades weren't enough. Part 2. The Acoustic Shield, Subtopographic Shipyards. The pirates were essentially utilizing early stealth technology to mask their operations from the main shipping lanes. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the secret lies entirely in the biology, specifically Spartina alterniflora, otherwise known as smooth cordgrass. This plant created a highly efficient, entirely natural sound trap. The ridiculously flat profile of the islands, combined with the dense stalks of this grass, naturally held millions of microscopic air pockets. And those air pockets just so happen to be incredibly effective at absorbing low and mid-frequency sound waves. Think about the sheer, overwhelming volume of an 18th century shipyard for a second. You have the deafening, sharp strikes of caulking irons driving oakum into hull seams. You have the heavy, rhythmic grinding of massive timber saws. You have the roaring heat and ringing anvils of blacksmith forges. Normally, across open water, you would easily hear this kind of industrial violence from miles away. But here, in the atmospheric interface of the Tangier Marsh, there is just an eerie, deadened silence. The environment simply swallows the sound completely. That number right there, 3 to 5, is the maximum elevation in feet above sea level for these entire islands. Because the profile was so incredibly low, a pirate sloop could be entirely careened, meaning tilted right on its side on a muddy bank for major repairs, inside a tidal gut. They would just drop their masts, bring the hull below the grass line, and visually vanish over the horizon. I mean, imagine the sheer audacity of this. A pirate fleet could be rebuilding an entire vessel in a bustling black market shipyard in total, absolute secrecy, just 3 miles away from a passing British frigate. Incredible. The defensive perimeter wasn't just in the mud and the grass, though. Part 3. The Estuarian Trap, the Kedges Straits. Let's shift our focus to the highly volatile water gateways that actually connect the open bay to the deep waters of the Sound. And this brilliantly illustrates the extreme hydraulic barrier created right here in the Kedges Straits, where massive environmental forces collide. Fresh water from the northern rivers violently mixes with heavy saltwater from the Atlantic. This creates an environment of severe, genuinely terrifying underwater topography shifts. Literally, one moment, you are cruising in safe, navigable waters reaching 90 feet deep. The very next second, the floor instantly shifts, dropping to a depth of less than 4 feet. But the outlaws had mapped the exact tracks of these deep water fingers over months of painstaking trial and error. This was their ultimate escape hatch. When caught in a storm or under heavy naval pursuit, they would run these straits at maximum speed. A naval captain, seeing the pirate ships somehow make it through, would naturally attempt to mirror their exact trajectory. But what they didn't know about were the hydraulic shears. Invisible, underlying cross-currents would catch those heavy naval hulls, violently pushing them sideways onto the flanking sand shoals. The result? Instantaneous, lethal grounding, complete rudder destruction, and a brutal, sudden end to the chase. So the crucial point is, when you put all these pieces together, the true genius of the Tangier Sound reveals itself. It wasn't just some random lucky hiding spot. It was a highly engineered fortress. They used the peat guts and dark silts for total visual concealment. They used the unconsolidated silt and low-elevation cordgrass for acoustic shielding, creating completely invisible shipyards. And they used the shifting quartz sands of the Kedges Straits to structurally destroy their enemies. The outlaws of the Atlantic didn't just survive here. They quite literally weaponized the architecture of the Earth itself. But as the pirate fleet moves further down the spine of the estuary, the environment violently shifts from soft mud and marsh grass to a massive battleground of open water and deep-sea trenches. What happens when we enter the lower bay, where the mighty James and York rivers dump their currents into the deep Atlantic canyons? Forget the parrots, the peglegs, and the buried treasure. If you think the golden age of piracy was just a bunch of lucky, reckless swashbucklers waving cutlasses, well, you're in for a shock. This explainer is going to completely shatter everything you think you know. We're bypassing all that superficial folklore today. Instead, we're diving straight into the cold, hard, physical science behind historical stealth. When I first read this quote from our source material, it literally reframed the entire era for me. To the scientist, piracy during the Golden Age was an exercise in applied hydrography and tactical geomorphology. I mean, wow, right? We need to completely change how we view these historical outlaws. They weren't just sailors out looking for a fight. They were absolute master hydrographers. They survived by exploiting this massive, hyper-complex geological anomaly that the greatest naval empire in the world simply couldn't map, let alone control. So are you ready to bypass the myths? Because forget the open ocean. In this explainer, we're going on a cinematic, spatial tour of what was absolutely the most sophisticated, naturally engineered stealth network in the entire Western Hemisphere, the Chesapeake Bay. We are going to look at exactly how the land itself became a weapon. Part 1. The post-glacial wound, or the birth of the labyrinth. To understand this ultimate cloaking device, we actually have to rewind the clock way, way back. Our deep-time origin story starts about 18,000 years ago. Picture this. The Laurentide ice sheet held North America in this massive frozen grip, and as it finally melted, it unleashed unimaginable volumes of highly pressurized meltwater. We're talking catastrophic force here, carving deep, violent canyons straight through the Atlantic coastal plain. Then, during the Holocene epoch, the ocean swelled up. The Atlantic rushed right into these freshly carved canyons, literally drowning the ancient Susquehanna River Valley. Fast forward to the golden age of piracy, and our outlaws are fully exploiting this flooded, hyper-complex estuary. So what did all that catastrophic hydrologic force leave behind? 11,000 miles. Just wrap your head around that. That is the staggering number of miles of fractured, labyrinth-like shoreline created by this drowned river valley. It wasn't just a big, uniform body of water. It was a sprawling, waterlogged maze that extended over 200 miles inland. And this sets up a stark, honestly almost comical contrast. On one side, you've got the mighty British Royal Navy. They're operating these massive, heavy, rigid warships with incredibly deep drafts. To them, the Chesapeake was a dynamic death trap, just full of blind corners. But on the other side, you've the pirate sloops. These were swift vessels with really shallow drafts, boasting high maneuverability. They were literally built for what experts call interfacial concealment. Which brings us to Zone 1, the lower eastern shore, specifically the Tangier Finger Creeks. Out here, the land itself provided the absolute perfect geological kill zone. Now, this region is what geologists call a dissected coastal plain. Unlike the rocky coasts you might see up in New England, this area is made entirely of loose, unconsolidated sediments, sands, silts, and clays. And because of those ancient, buried Susquehanna tributaries we just talked about, the land is carved into these narrow, meandering tidal rivers, like the Pocomoke, that twist and turn at incredibly violent 90-degree angles. Just imagine trying to hide an 80-foot mast out on the open ocean. It's impossible, right? But here, it's a whole different ballgame. The outlaws would sail past those sharp river bends right into the interior Finger Creeks. They'd drop their topmasts and pull their ships snugly against the muddy, overhanging banks. And because the land was totally flat but covered in an old-growth white cedar and oak forest canopy right up to the water's edge, well, the forest just absorbed the profile of the rigging. The ship essentially vanished. They were literally using the forest as an organic camouflage net. But visual masking? That was only half the defense. Those world-renowned London naval charts? Completely useless here. The waters in these Finger Creeks were deeply stained with tannins from the surrounding cypress swamps, turning the water into this dark, tea-like opacity. I mean, imagine the sheer, frustrating terror of a British captain chasing a pirate into this swamp. The dark water completely hid the subsurface topography. A pirate could safely drop anchor in a deep micropole that was literally inches away from a lethal sandbar, and the naval pursuer would have absolutely no visual way to read the depth until, bam, they violently ran aground. Heading further north, we hit Zone 2, mid-bay intersections, or the silt sieves of Kent and Tilghman. This is a notoriously volatile choke point. The defining feature here is longshore sediment transport. Driven by the bay's incredibly powerful north-to-south tidal flush, this area is basically a constantly morphing grid of shallow, hidden shoals that get reshaped by every single major storm. And the outlaws didn't just use this shifting underwater architecture to hide, they actually weaponized it. Here is exactly how they pulled off this kinetic heist. Step 1. A pirate sloop, drawing only about 5 feet of water, acts as bait out in the open bay. Step 2. The outlaws flee directly into the narrow guts near Poplar Island. Step 3. The heavily armed British warship, drawing maybe 15 to 20 feet of water, gets overconfident and charges blindly in pursuit. And Step 4. The massive warship violently slams into a hidden, shifting silt bar at 10 knots. That sheer structural impact would often crack the Navy ship's keel outright, or at least trap it for days, leaving this massive warship completely defenseless against the highly maneuverable outlaw fleet. Continuing all the way up to the northernmost tip, we find Zone 3, Upper Bay Deltas, the winter riverine redoubts. Up here, the massive Susquehanna River creates a totally different style of sanctuary. This right here is a high-energy delta zone. The ultimate landscape clue is this abrupt transition where the coarse river gravel suddenly meets the fine, gooey mud of the bay. What that indicates is an ancient boundary where the water velocity suddenly drops. And if you knew exactly how to read that geological clue, you could find the pirates' most secret bases. And man, what an advantage this zone provided. These deep subaquatic basins were completely surrounded by impenetrable wild rice fields. But the real genius here? It's the thermodynamics. The constant flow of fresh water pouring in from the massive Susquehanna actually prevented bee-specific basins from freezing solid as quickly as the saltwater marshes further down the bay. Just think about the irony for a second. The mighty, world-dominating British Empire and their merchant vessels are frozen stuck in the lower bay's ice packs during the winter, while the outlaws maintain a year-round ice-free mobile base to stage continuous ambushes. Which brings us to our final section, the ultimate stealth matrix, a masterpiece of tactical hydrography. When we pull all this data together, It is just incredible to see how flawlessly these outlaws mapped deep-time geology to ensure their own survival. Down in the Tangier Creeks, they used clay and tannin silts for mask masking and total visual obliteration. Over in the Poplar Island channels, they weaponized shifting sandbars to physically ground their heavy pursuers. And up in the Susquehanna Delta, they leveraged those coarse gravel transitions to secure ice-free winter anchorages. Every single geological zone had a highly specific structural defense and a brilliant tactical exploitation. So, looking at all of this, it becomes incredibly clear. The outlaws of the Golden Age were not simply lucky. Not at all. They survived, thrived, and dominated because they were absolute master readers of this deep-time geological architecture. They literally understood the science of the landscape better than the highly trained imperial cartographers who were hunting them. But the labyrinth actually gets even deeper and a whole lot stranger as we move south toward the volatile heart of the estuary. The source leaves us with this really haunting question. What happens when the shifting marsh matrices become so dense that the land itself begins to act like a fluid? How did outlaws build hidden black market shipyards using acoustic dampening and false channels? Well, that is where the geography truly turns into a phantom grid. And that's something we might just have to explore in our next explainer.